I'm Billy S, welcome back to the channel. Today we're taking a look at the dungeons of the Legend of Zelda, the Minish Cap, as I rank them from worst to best. Perhaps this is a hot take, but the Minish Cap has the best quality of top-down Zelda dungeons in the series. The aesthetics in every location are gorgeous, with the colourful Wind Waker-inspired sprite work on full display. Each dungeon has its own unique gimmicks and elements to overcome, and a ton of extra goodies to find within. Extra kinstone pieces are the main loot, but Minish Cap is the first game to consistently reward the player with extra pieces of heart within their dungeons, separate to the heart container you'd normally get for killing the bosses. But which of these dastardly dungeons stands supreme? Let's find out. So be sure to parry that subscribe button to stay up to date on all my future videos, and without further ado, all 6 dungeons in the Legend of Zelda, the Minish Cap, ranked. Let me know your favourite down below. At number 6, we have the Cave of Flames, the second dungeon of the game. While it's true that the Minish Cap has some incredibly well-designed dungeons, they all fit into familiar tropes that we're used to in the series. The Cave of Flames, being the resident fire dungeon, does very little to make itself stand out from the crowd. Its main mechanic are these minecarts that you can use to zip around the dungeon at high speeds. You need to use them to reach inaccessible rooms, while flipping the tracks at certain junctions to make progress. I love the screams of Link and the sheer horror of Eslo as the carts go at Mach speeds, adding a nice touch of comedy to the proceedings. The other main gimmick of the dungeon are these holes, which you can activate with the dungeon item, the Cane of Pachi. Fire a bad boy in there, hop inside, and you'll blast upwards into the air. Some memorable moments include the various Minish puzzles that have you slipping through wall cracks to find paths to the next part of the dungeon, often involving Link needing to avoid obstacles as he goes. The standout for me being the room on the lowest floor where you need to dodge 4 swinging blade traps, only to enter a room with 3 stationary chasers. They won't chase Minish Link, but the growth platform is right at the back of the room, leading to a fun chase sequence after you return to regular size. I also love this room soon after, where you can use the rollerbite enemies to fill in the holes to reach a treasure chest. And of course, the grand lava room that leads to the boss key uses the Cane of Pachi to great effect, launching you upwards into whirlwinds that you can glide across to reach the big key. All capped off with the Glee Rock boss fight, and you can find out my opinions on him in my Minish Cap boss ranking video I did last week, link in the description. It's a better than average fire dungeon, but it just doesn't capture my interest in the same way as the rest of the roster. At number 5, we have the Fortress of Winds, the third dungeon of the game. Contrary to its name, it's actually Minish Cap's Earth Temple, as the Wind Tribe have long since abandoned their earthly home, making their roost in the skies above Hyrule instead. That little bait and switch makes the Fortress of Winds very memorable on a first playthrough. Immediately, you have multiple paths you can take to progress through the dungeon, with a host of different floors to explore, and a series of keys needed to progress further in. The main host of enemies here are Stalfos, with the ruins swarming with the undead creatures, bats, and in certain rooms, the occasional like. The puzzles revolve around both fighting enemies to progress, avoiding traps, and using your new bow received in Caster Wilds to shoot eye switches and take down Armos Knights and Igors. The first half of the dungeon sees you collecting 2 keys by climbing to the top left and rightmost sides of the complex, then using a handle to release the keys that drop to the first floor so you can collect them. Eventually, you gain access to the dungeon item, the Mole Mitts, which allows you to tear through all the pillars of earth you've seen while exploring. It makes rechecking each path of the dungeon worth your while, as you'll find extra chests and rooms to explore. The Dark Nut mini-boss is a bit of a letdown, as you already faced one in Caster Wild, making this variant feel a little stale. Had this been the enemy's first appearance, I'd be way more high on the encounter. The best puzzle though was this block pushing puzzle where you had to clone Link in such a way to hold all 4 of these buttons down, followed by needing to escape the room by hiding in the tiny holes to avoid the metallic spike logs. But that's the main problem I have with the Fortress of Winds. While I love the idea of this dungeon's progression, I don't think any one part of this complex feels particularly memorable, and it's rather forgettable beyond that opening corridor with the 5 different paths you can take once you have the mole mitts. Mazal, the boss, is the sole exception, but it has little bearing to me when I'm ranking the dungeon itself. At number 4, we have Dark Hyrule Castle, the final dungeon of the game. Now, as long-term viewers know, I've had a bit of a love-hate relationship with the final dungeons of Zelda games, but Minish Cap is one of the rare instances where I think Dark Hyrule Castle falls into the love category. Ever since Ocarina of Time, final dungeons seem to feel like throwaways, designed to be short and surface value. I'm a bit tired of the, now let's relive this better dungeon from earlier in the game with a puzzle or two from it formula that the 3D games like to do. But the last 2D games I played, the Oracle pair, also had really bad final dungeons. Nobody's remembering Onox's Keep or the Black Tower. So Minish Cap coming in with a Dark Hyrule Castle that is layered with both story and difficulty without feeling tedious is a brilliant move. You first have to save the King and Knights of Hyrule in the basement using your newly powered up Four Sword. You've got Wizrobes, Moldorms, Stalfos, Bubbles, Firebars, Moblins, all trying to stop you. I love the little puzzles that use the Four Sword mechanic, like hitting the 4 cannonballs back at these turrets normally, then having to do the same but on a vertical scale, which was way harder to pull off as you had to turn around lightning fast to get the timing right. Or using the Four Sword to move through this block structure while a blade trap tries to stop you by hitting your clones as it moves around it. Then you reach the top floor where you need to visit every corner to collect keys so you can eventually reach the boss key. You're challenged with Gibdos and multiple Dark Nuts trying to stop your progression, and that's not taking into account the gliding sections outside with the whirlwinds. Dark Hyrule Castle does challenge you on everything you've learned, but has a great aesthetic, a really diverse layout, and some original puzzles courtesy of the Four Sword that makes it also feel like its own entity, as opposed to a dungeon that's just the sum of the rest of the game's dungeons parts. Not top 3 worthy, but I think when I get around to ranking the final dungeons in every Zelda game, Dark Hyrule Castle will be in a very good spot for sure. At number 3, we have Deepwood Shrine, the first dungeon of the game. This is the first of 2 Minish dungeons, where Link explores the complex in his Minish form. What this means is that we lose the element of switching between sizes that makes up some of the more interesting puzzles later in the game, but it allows the Minish dungeons to really come alive with their setting. Where else is the central gimmick of the dungeon going to be a rotating barrel, where depending on how you exit, you can end up in multiple different places in the main room? Where else is the basement floor going to be a water parkour challenge where you use the gust jar to push a lily pad down a large river? The enemies are your standard first dungeon fare, incredibly easy. The Muldozers barely pose a threat, the red pesto flies around charging at Link but is incredibly easy to bat away, and the Slugulars are the definition of fodder. The Puffstools are the only real threat, hiding within dust spores, awaiting their chance to attack Link as they are immune to his sword. It's only after getting the Gust Jar that you can suck up their spores and make them vulnerable to attack. And the Gust Jar itself is honestly a really inspired item that continues to have use long after you leave Deepwood. From sucking up dust and webs, to pulling back mushrooms that you can launch from, to helping suck up dangerous attacks from enemies in the late game. You see exactly what it can do from moment 1, and it never lets up on its utility. My only complaint about this dungeon comes from the second piece of heart you can get by teleporting from the entrance to the back of the first floor. The trick, you need to activate the teleporter in this room first by uncovering 2 switches. But if you fail to do that for whatever reason before collecting the boss key, there is no way to get back to that room. The main barrel has shifted places due to a puzzle you solved earlier in the dungeon, and you can't go back down the boss key corridor because the lily pad is despawned. You have to wait until you get the flippers later in the game, and then come back, swim through the canal, activate the teleporter, return to the entrance, and finally get that piece of heart. This really bothered me, because it happened to me. I dealt with this exact scenario. There should never be a point where parts of the dungeon become completely inaccessible, and it's a big blemish on what's otherwise a fairly fresh standard starting dungeon. But it's too iconic to Minish Cap's identity for me to rank it any lower than third. We all know Deepwood Shrine and the concept of a dungeon at minuscule size, so the bronze medal feels fitting. At number 2, we have the Temple of Droplets, the 4th dungeon of the game, and the 2nd of the Minish dungeons. Found in an icy crag in Lake Hylia, you shrink down into this dungeon to collect the next element needed to recharge the Bakori blade, and I really like the way it handles progression. You're immediately introduced to ice block pushing puzzles and how you need to use the sunlight from above to melt the blocks and obtain the items inside. Firstly, a key, and then the boss key. Straight away. Huh. As it turns out, the boss of the dungeon is a frozen Octorok, and in the center of that room is the frozen element. So you need to go through the rest of the dungeon, finding paths to take you back to this room, allowing you to flip the levers and bring sunlight back to the temple. Side note, I love that this dungeon is shaped like a bottle, and that there's also an item you can collect by swimming into a bottle formation in the water. Really cute design there. You have to explore the upper level, releasing lily pads and killing enemies, until you drop down to the basement. There's a large river here you can push yourself down, with you needing the lily pads so you can climb up onto specific types of platforms. Some of the rooms are dark, which you can't initially explore, but the dungeon item, the lantern, allows you to take those darkened pathways to reach the second main lever. There are 2 mini-boss moments in this temple, the Scissors Beetles, of which there are 3 you encounter at the end of the first half of the temple, and they are hard, easily the toughest enemy to fight as a Minish due to their boomerang mandibles. Then there's the big blue choo-choo, who acts as a tougher variant of the first boss of the game, complete with electricity to make you struggle. I really enjoyed this encounter. It's a great way to spice up the difficulty and completely works with the choo-choos. For what ends up being a fairly linear dungeon crawl, I think the Temple of Droplets does a good job of hiding that by taking you all across the dungeon's layout on your first pass. So when you open up that first sunlight hatch and gain access to the second half of the dungeon, you already feel like you understand the layout. So when you reach a darkened room you've been in from a different angle, you get that aha moment I really enjoy. It doesn't take the ice gimmicks too far, the lantern ends up being a perfect tool for getting through the second half, and there are some memorable rooms as well. Hiding beneath the water to avoid spiked rollers near the dungeon's conclusion, or how about dropping down the waterfall atop a lily pad? Navigating a darkened maze by lighting up braziers as you go, it's all really ice solid. No complaints. Except the boss fight, but that's just me not finding it all that good. At number 1, we have the Palace of Winds, the 5th dungeon of the game. Found atop the cloud tops, this is a fascinating dungeon that does a great job at building up player expectations and then smashing them midway through. You start on the outside of the temple, and you're led to believe that this is the dungeon. After all, you've been parkouring through the clouds to get here, it makes sense this would be a fully open-air experience. Each layer of the dungeon, you reach higher and higher, overcoming little Minish puzzles, taking on enemies, jumping on clouds to reach higher points with the rocks cape you obtain early on. There are tons of metal grates where you can jump through specific trapdoors either upwards or downwards, creating a lot of timing-based puzzles. I like the rooms where you have to jump with wind turbines at your back to create a lot of distance. It feels really good to pull off. Enemies are plentiful, with moblins and wizrobes being the main concern. There's a room towards the end of the dungeon where wizrobes ambush you while you need to bomb a wall to progress, and it's a lot of fun dodging through their projectiles to accomplish this. But once you reach the top of the dungeon, collect the boss key, and find the boss door, you're done here. Only to realize, wait, you didn't collect the map or the compass. So you open the boss door, see a giant arrow pointing into a hole in the ground, you drop down, and it's a Dark Nut mini-boss. Yep, the dungeon baits you into thinking you've reached the end, only to reveal there's an entire indoor section of the map, and you have to work your way back up from the very bottom floor to reach the top where the boss door actually awaits. Indoors, there's a lot of floor switching, falling through holes, avoiding traps, and broken floors. It's really fun stuff and takes everything you've learned, challenges you to overcome every tough enemy, and hurdle so you can make it out alive. It reminds me a lot of the Stone Tower Temple in Majora's Mask. There, you have to flip the temple upside down, revealing the second half. Here, you have to fall back down to the bottom to reveal a hidden second half. Not to mention, both temples play with the setting of the skies in unique ways. I mention this because Stone Tower is one of my favorite dungeons in the series, so if Palace of Winds is making me think of comparisons, that's only a good thing. It all comes to a head with a surprisingly difficult final room featuring broken floors, spear moblins, fire wizrobes, and red Stalfos, who all try to gang up on you as you desperately attempt to reach the last set of clouds that lead to the boss room. This was the toughest part of the dungeon for me, and I was impressed by the level of difficulty here. And then the dungeon boss is a perfect cherry on top, just one of the most unique fights in the series. Palace of Winds might just be the best wind temple in the series, and I'm glad to give it the love that it deserves. And that's my list. Which Minish Cap dungeon is your favorite? Let me know down below, and be sure to parry that subscribe button so you can stay up to date on all my future videos. I want to give a shout out to my YouTube channel members for supporting me for another month. It costs $4.99. It gets you early access to future videos, a shout out in the description and at the end of videos as well, and access to special Let's Plays that only you channel members can receive. So if you guys want to follow me somewhere else, you can check out my Blue Sky. That is my main link. It is down below in the description. And I'll see you next time, as in the next Zelda game. Oh, we're covering Twilight Princess. I'm so excited. Adios.